Imagine a concert pianist right in the middle of this wildly complex Rachmaninoff concerto.
Oh, yeah. We're talking maybe 15 notes a second. It's incredibly fast.
Right, it's just a complete blur of motion. And like, if that pianist were to suddenly stop in the middle of that furious sequence and consciously think about it like, okay, my left ring finger needs to move a quarter inch to the right to hit E flat.
The entire performance would just instantly crash.
Exactly, because the conscious mind, it simply cannot compute at that speed. So if the conscious mind isn't actually driving the hands, who or what is actually playing the piano?
Well, this is the ultimate paradox of human mastery,
Right.
really. I mean, we spend thousands of hours and immense conscious effort, all with one goal,
Which is what?
to basically train our bodies to perform entirely without us.
That is just wild to think about. Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today we are taking a magnifying glass to the literal mind of a master.
It's a fascinating topic.
Our mission today is to answer a question that goes to the very core of how we learn. When an expert performs flawlessly, whether they are playing a violin or hitting a 90-mile-an-hour tennis serve.
Or even executing a complex surgical incision.
Right. Are they just thinking faster than the rest of us? Or, have they managed to stop thinking altogether?
What we are really exploring here is this microscopic, totally silent tug of war happening inside your head every single time you try to learn a new skill.
A biological tug of war. I love that.
Yeah, it's a battle for control between the brain's executive command center, the prefrontal cortex, which handles our conscious, deliberate thoughts, and the brain's deeply embedded habit circuitry.
And that habit circuitry is primarily anchored in an ancient subcortical structure called the basal ganglia, right?
Exactly. The basal ganglia.
And this tug of war is highly relevant to you listening to this right now, whether you are trying to learn a new language or, trying to fix a terrible golf swing.
Or if you're just endlessly curious about the neurobiology of how humans actually get good at things.
Yeah. Understanding this physical transition inside your skull can completely revolutionize how you approach practice. We are talking about the journey from clumsy amateur to automatic expert.
And looking at the neuroscience of that journey, it really changes our very definition of what learning actually is.
How so?
Well, it's not just acquiring information, It is a structural, literal, geographical migration of control across the brain.
To really see that migration, we need to look at what physically happens inside the brain of someone performing at an elite level compared to someone who is just starting out.
And there's this highly foundational study that captures this contrast just beautifully.
Right, a team of researchers led by Martin Lotze. They published a paper back in 2003 in the journal Neuroimage.
Yes, the paper is titled The Musician's Brain Functional Imaging of Amateurs and Professionals During Performance and Imagery.
They wanted to look at the musician's brain, specifically comparing functional imaging of amateurs and professionals during a performance.
The experimental design here is quite elegant in its simplicity, really. Lotze and his team took two distinct groups.
So you had amateur violinists, people who enjoyed playing, maybe practiced a couple of hours a week.
Right, people who were very much still consciously managing the instrument.
Yeah.
And then you had seasoned professionals.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. These are individuals who've been playing for decades, dedicating 30, 40 hours a week to their craft since childhood.
Yeah.
And the researchers put both groups into an fMRI machine.
And for anyone who hasn't been in an fMRI, it's basically a giant, incredibly loud magnetic tube. It's not exactly a place where you can easily whip out a violin.
No, definitely not. So they had the participants execute a very specific, limited musical sequence just with their fingers.
And they also had them just mentally imagine executing the sequence, right?
Yes, which is a clever way to isolate the brain's motor planning from the actual physical movement itself.
While the participants were doing this, the researchers were tracking a few different biological metrics simultaneously. First, the fMRI was tracking BOLD signals.
Right. BOLD stands for blood oxygen level dependent signals.
So what does that actually mean in plain English?
The basic principle is that when a specific region of your brain works harder, the neurons there need more energy. So the body rushes oxygen-rich blood to that exact microscopic neighborhood.
And the scanner detects those minute changes in blood flow.
Exactly. So they're watching the brain's resource management in real time. But they also hook the participants up to EMG, or electromyography.
To track the actual electrical activity in the forearm muscles, right?
Yes, they wanted to see the command leaving the brain and actually hitting the muscle.
And for the imagination part of the test, they used a visual analog scale. That way, participants could rate how vivid their mental imagery was.
They essentially built a complete map,
Yeah.
the brain's command, the muscle's execution, and the subjective experience.
And when you lay the brain scans of the amateurs next to the professionals, they look like two completely different species.
It really is a study in contrasts. Both groups showed activation, but the pattern was entirely different.
When the amateurs attempted the musical sequence, their brains just lit up widely. The activity was heavily distributed.
Yeah, it's heavily distributed.
I picture it like a massive floodlight turning on in a dark room. The amateurs had significant activation in the bilateral primary motor cortex.
Now that's fascinating because they were only moving one hand, but both the left and right motor areas of the brain were firing.
They were also lighting up the superior parietal lobes and various prefrontal areas, which makes sense. I mean, they are consciously thinking, wait, where does this finger go next?
Exactly, they're actively monitoring. And they had significant activity in a structure called the left caudate nucleus.
Which sits deep inside the basal ganglia, right?
Yes. They were recruiting every available cognitive resource just to manage the basic execution of the sequence. It is an incredibly energy-intensive, highly inefficient way to operate.
But then you look at the scans of the professional violinists, and the floodlight is gone?
Completely gone. Instead, you see this highly calibrated, tightly circumscribed laser pointer.
So the brain actually gets quieter.
Radically quieter. The professionals primarily used only their contralateral primary motor cortex.
Meaning, if they were moving their left hand, only the exact corresponding hand control area in the right hemisphere of the brain lit up.
Right. They didn't activate the other side at all. They didn't light up the prefrontal cortex. It was just the primary motor cortex and their primary auditory cortex.
Probably because they were implicitly hearing the music they were playing in their heads.
That's the most likely explanation, yes.
The efficiency of that is just staggering. And the researchers didn't just point at pictures. They quantified this efficiency.
Yes. They looked at the relationship between the Boldy signal in the brain and the EMG signal in the forearm.
And for the professionals, the correlation between the intensity of the brain activity in that specific motor area and the actual muscle execution was astonishingly tight.
Extremely tight. In biological systems, we measure these relationships with a correlation coefficient. A perfect one-to-one relationship is a 1.0.
And what did the professionals score?
The professionals showed a correlation of 0.82 between their brain activity and their muscle firing.
Wow. Which, I mean, outside of a textbook, is virtually a biological mirror.
It really is. It means the relationship between the command center and the muscle is so highly optimized, there is practically zero signal leakage.
Every ounce of neural energy is being translated directly into precisely calibrated physical movement.
And it gets better. They also found that the earlier in life these professionals began their musical training, the higher the activation in their ipsilateral cerebellar hemispheres.
So the brain had structurally adapted over decades to support this highly specific output. The professional has literally pruned away all the unnecessary neurological noise.
Precisely.
Okay, so the amateur is using a floodlight, stumbling around, trying to find the light switch, extending massive amounts of energy.
And the professional uses a laser pointer to hit the exact switch with zero wasted effort.
But hold on, this brings up a massive paradox in the Lotze study. You mentioned earlier that the amateurs had all this activity in the caudate nucleus, which is a key part of the basal ganglia.
I did, yes.
Now, in the world of neuroscience, the basal ganglia is famously known as the brain's habit center, right?
It is the absolute engine of automaticity, yes.
So why on earth was the habit center active only in the amateurs? Shouldn't the seasoned professionals, the people who have practiced this sequence thousands of times until it is a deeply ingrained habit, be using their habit systems the most?
It's a great question.
Why did the experts' basal ganglia basically go dark?
That apparent contradiction puzzled researchers for quite a while, actually. On the surface, it seems entirely counterintuitive.
Right. If expertise is about building habits, why do experts seem to use the habit center less?
To solve this puzzle, we have to look much closer at the basal ganglia itself. It is not just a single uniform lump of tissue that simply turns on or off.
It's more complicated than that.
Much more. It is a complex, heavily segregated geographical landscape.
So we really need to look at the shifting geography of the habit factory. And there are two landmark papers that map this out perfectly for us.
Yes, these are crucial.
First, we have a 2006 paper by Yin and Knowlton, published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, titled The Role of the Basal Ganglia in Habit Formation.
A true classic in the field.
And second, a brilliantly detailed 2015 review by Anne Graybiel in Cold Spring Harbor Perspectives in Biology called The Striatum Where Skills and Habits Meet.
These papers are foundational because they break down the actual plumbing of subcortical learning.
To understand the paradox, we first need to understand the architecture.
Right. So the basal ganglia has an input station called the striatum, which receives information from all over the cortex. And it has an output station called the pallidum, which sends signals back up to the motor areas.
So it's like a massive routing station in the middle of the brain.
Exactly. And the way it routes information is deeply fascinating because it operates fundamentally differently than the outer layers of your brain. Well, in the cortex, the primary currency of communication is glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It tells other neurons to fire.
It says go.
Yes. But down in the basal ganglia, the projection neurons use a neurotransmitter called GABA. And GABA is inhibitory. It tells other neurons to stay quiet.
Okay, let's unpack this, because inhibition is such a cool concept in neuroscience. We tend to think that doing something like moving your arm requires the brain to actively turn a signal on.
That's the common assumption.
But the brain is inherently noisy. If every neuron fired at once, we'd literally have a seizure. So the basal ganglia acts more like a sculptor, right?
I love that analogy.
It starts with a block of stone representing all possible movements, and it selectively chips away the movements you don't want, leaving only the perfect intended movement.
That is a wonderful way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
The basal ganglia keeps the entire motor system under constant heavy braking.
It's riding the brakes.
Constantly. When you want to move, the basal ganglia doesn't hit a gas pedal. It selectively releases the brakes on a specific motor program while keeping the brakes clamped down tight on everything else.
And it does this through internal pathways, right?
Yes, the direct pathway, which releases the brakes to facilitate movement, and the indirect and hyperdirect pathways, which apply the brakes to suppress competing movements.
Okay, so back to our amateur violinists. They're in the fMRI, they're trying to play the sequence, and their caudate nucleus is lighting up. Why the caudate?
This is the absolute key to the paradox. The input station of the basal ganglia, the striatum, is divided into distinct territories.
It's zoned differently.
Exactly. The caudate, or the dorsomedial striatum, is part of what we call the associative network. It is heavily connected to the prefrontal cortex. Its specific job is to handle goal-directed, conscious, highly effortful learning.
Which is exactly what an amateur is doing. They're evaluating every single finger placement.
Yes, they are thinking, if I press here, does it sound right? No, that was sharp, let me adjust.
They are operating on a completely conscious associative level.
Precisely. They are actively evaluating the outcome of their actions in real time. But as you practice, as you literally grind through hundreds and thousands of repetitions, the control of that behavior physically migrates.
It moves across the geography of the basal ganglia.
It moves from the associative caudate over to a completely different territory called the putamen, specifically the dorsolateral striatum.
And the putamen does something totally different.
Very different. The putamen is the heart of the sensorimotor network. It doesn't talk to the prefrontal cortex nearly as much. It talks directly to the motor cortex.
So it bypasses the conscious part?
Exactly. It doesn't care about evaluating goals or figuring things out. It only cares about executing highly specific, highly rehearsed physical movements.
So the professionals in the Lotze study didn't stop using habits. The habits simply moved.
That's the secret. The amateurs were using the conscious associative caudate. The professionals had shifted the behavior entirely to the sensorimotor putamen, which operates basically below the level of conscious effort.
So the habit physically relocates. But Graybiel's 2015 paper takes this a step further, looking at what the neurons in the putamen are actually doing once the habit has moved into their neighborhood.
Yes, and she describes a phenomenon called task bracketing, which is just incredible.
I find this absolutely mind-blowing.
It is arguably one of the most elegant discoveries in motor learning. Graybiel's team actually managed to record the spike activity of individual neurons in the sensorimotor striatum day by day as subjects learned a habit.
You would naturally assume that if the putamen is running a habit, those neurons would be firing continuously for the entire duration of the behavior, right?
That's what logic would suggest.
Yeah.
But that's not what happens at all.
Right. They found that in the expert brain, the neurons in the putamen fire a massive burst at the very beginning of a routine.
So a huge spike.
Then, during the actual complex execution of the behavior, they go almost completely quiet. and then they fire another massive burst at the very end. They are literally bracketing the task.
The brain is actively marking the boundaries of the action sequence. It signals the start, and it signals the completion.
It's like the expert brain basically zip files the entire behavior into a single digital folder.
I like that.
The burst at the beginning is the brain double-clicking to open the file. Once the file is open, the program just runs itself. The brain goes quiet in the middle, and the burst at the end is the brain hitting save and close.
The conscious mind, and even the active monitoring systems of the basal ganglia, totally bypass the middle.
That zip file analogy highlights the concept of chunking perfectly.
It does. By marking the start and end boundaries, a complex sequence of dozens of individual muscle movements is neurologically represented as a single, cohesive unit. You don't have to trigger each movement sequentially anymore. You just trigger the chunk.
Think about your drive to work. For a new driver, driving is not chunked at all.
No, it's terrifying. You are actively thinking about the gas, the brake, the mirrors, the steering wheel.
Your associative caudate is just firing constantly. But once you are an expert driver, the route becomes a habit. You get in the car, you start the engine, that's the opening task bracket.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you pull into your office parking lot, the closing bracket, and you realize you have absolutely no conscious memory of the middle 15 minutes of the drive. The middle was entirely zip-filed.
And because it was zip-filed, your prefrontal cortex was totally free to think about your grocery list or a meeting you have later that day. That is the incredible utility of task bracketing. It frees up our highest level cognitive resources.
So this perfectly resolves the paradox of the amateur and the expert. The amateur is using a floodlight because they are stuck in the caudate, manually firing every single step.
And the expert uses a laser pointer because they've moved the behavior to the putamen and zipped it into a single chunk.
But this introduces a very practical chronological problem. We know the habit moves from the caudate to the putamen, but when does that actually happen?
How the timeline.
Right, because if I practice a piano scale for an hour, I don't magically wake up the next day as a task bracketing expert. How does this rewiring actually unfold over time?
To map that timeline, we really have to look at longitudinal studies, experiments that track individuals over an extended period of intense practice.
And we have two highly revealing sources to pull from here.
You do?
The first is a 2020 paper by Berlot and colleagues, published in eLife, titled A Critical Reevaluation of fMRI Signatures of Motor Sequence Learning.
An excellent modern study.
And the second is a classic 2005 paper by Russell Poldrack and colleagues in the Journal of Neuroscience, titled The Neural Correlates of Motor Skill Automaticity.
Let's start with Berlot because the sheer scale of this experiment is wild.
Yeah, they didn't just look at a few days of practice. They had subjects undergo 4 separate MRI scans over the course of 5 whole weeks.
And during those 5 weeks, the subjects performed roughly 4,000 trials of complex 9-digit keyboard sequences. 4,000 repetitions.
Which is an insane amount of typing.
But it is exactly what is required to study true expertise. A lot of behavioral studies fall into the trap of observing subjects for, say, 3 days and declaring a habit formed. But true motor automaticity takes thousands of repetitions.
Berlot was looking for where exactly the skill was being stored as those weeks dragged on.
Right. Now, historically, many neuroscientists assumed that as you learn a physical skill, the primary motor cortex itself, M1, would change drastically.
Because M1 is the final output stage to the muscle, so the assumption was that the map inside M1 would radically alter.
Exactly. Going back to the old sensory homunculus maps, the idea was that if you use your fingers a lot, the finger area of your motor cortex should just balloon in size.
But Berlot's team found something highly surprising.
They did. Over the 5 weeks, the overall activity and the fundamental structure in the primary motor cortex didn't significantly change at all. M1 remained relatively stable.
Wait, really? So where did the changes happen?
Instead of M1, the fine-grained representations of the sequences, the actual learned patterns, were reorganizing outside of M1. Furthermore, they found that overall activation actually decreased in the premotor and parietal areas as the subjects mastered the sequence.
Just like our professional violinists from earlier, as the skill gets better, the brain gets quieter. The heavy lifting is migrating elsewhere.
Exactly. And Poldrack's 2005 study backs this up perfectly with a completely different methodology. They used what is called a serial reaction time task, or an SRT task.
The SRT task is basically a cornerstone of motor learning research, right?
It is. Subjects sit at a screen and react to visual cues by pressing corresponding buttons. What the subjects don't know is that the visual cues aren't random. They actually follow a repeating sequence.
And over time, even without consciously realizing there is a sequence, the subject's reaction times drop dramatically. Their brains implicitly learn the pattern.
But Poldrack added a devious little layer to this to test for show automaticity. They introduced a dual task condition.
Oh, this is the tone counting thing.
Yes. While the subjects were trying to do the button-pressing sequence, the researchers simultaneously played tones and made the subjects count the tones.
It is the ultimate test of cognitive bandwidth. If a skill is still relying on the conscious, goal-directed prefrontal cortex, introducing a distracting tone-counting task will cause the motor performance to just crash.
Because both tasks are competing for the exact same prefrontal resources. But if the skill has truly become automatic, the distraction shouldn't derail it.
And what Poldrack found was that after extensive training, performing this dual task required far less activity in the prefrontal cortex and the caudate.
The network of frontal and striatal regions that were completely overwhelmed during the novice phase essentially clocked out.
The subjects could count the tones perfectly while their fingers flew across the buttons without a second thought.
The conscious mind was entirely decoupled from the motor execution. But this raises a profound structural question, doesn't it?
Right. If the primary motor cortex isn't fundamentally changing, and the premotor areas are getting quieter, and the prefrontal cortex and caudate have clocked out, where exactly is the motor program running from?
Who is driving the bus?
Exactly. Who's in charge?
To answer that, we turn to a brilliant theoretical framework presented by Ashby and colleagues. This is a 2010 paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences titled Cortical and Basal Ganglia Contributions to Habit Learning and Automaticity.
Ashby proposed something really interesting about the basal ganglia's role.
He proposed that the basal ganglia doesn't actually store the final habit. Instead, the basal ganglia acts as a trainer for the cortex.
I love this concept, the basal ganglia as a coach. How does the coaching actually work?
Well, it relies heavily on dopamine and reinforcement learning. When you are learning the piano scale, the basal ganglia is constantly monitoring the outcomes.
Looking for success.
Right. When you hit the right note, a pulse of dopamine signals success. Over time, the basal ganglia figures out exactly which sequence of motor programs leads to that successful outcome.
And once it figures out the correct sequence, it repeatedly trains the cortex. It forces the cortical neurons to fire in that exact sequence over and over again.
And this taps into one of the most famous rules in all of neuroscience, Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together.
By forcing the cortical neurons to fire in unison thousands of times, the basal ganglia induces physical synaptic changes between those cortical neurons.
Over time, the brain creates what Ashby calls a cortical shortcut.
A direct connection across the surface of the brain. So if we imagine the brain's original pathways, like a small dirt road that has to wind all the way down into a deep valley, the basal ganglia to get approval.
And then wind all the way back up to the motor cortex to execute a movement.
That takes a lot of time and energy. But if you drive that dirt road 4,000 times, the brain eventually realizes this is terribly inefficient.
So it paves a highway.
Yes. It builds a massive, paved, elevated superhighway directly connecting the visual trigger in the cortex straight to the motor execution in the cortex. It entirely bypasses the valley.
The basal ganglia train the cortical representation, and once the superhighway is built, the basal ganglia steps back. The cortex can just run the behavior on its own, hyper-efficiently.
Let's pause and think about what this means from an evolutionary perspective, specifically regarding energy conservation.
It's a huge factor.
Because the human brain is a metabolic monster. It accounts for only about 2% of our body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of our daily calories.
And conscious prefrontal goal-directed processing, figuring things out, evaluating mistakes, holding things in working memory is incredibly expensive metabolically. It burns a lot of glucose.
Which for most of human history was a very scarce resource. You could not afford to spend massive amounts of calories simply walking or performing routine physical tasks.
Exactly. So expertise is fundamentally an energy-saving adaptation. The brain isn't just rewiring itself to make you better at the piano, it is rewiring itself to save calories.
By shifting the burden from the expensive prefrontal caudate loop to the hyper-efficient, fast-firing cortical superhighway, you free up energy to scan the horizon for predators.
Or forage for food. Or just listen to the other musicians in the orchestra.
It is the ultimate biological efficiency. Automaticity literally is survival.
It truly is.
But wait, If the basal ganglia is the coach that trains the cortex until the cortex can do it alone, is there another coach involved even earlier in the process?
What do you mean?
Well, because doing something for the 4,000th time is about building a superhighway. But getting on a bicycle for the very first time, or hitting a tennis ball on day one, feels entirely different. You aren't building a superhighway yet, you are just trying not to crash.
That is a crucial distinction to make. The basal ganglia handles the reinforcement, what actions lead to rewards. But it is actually not very good at real-time error correction in physical space.
So who does that?
For the absolute earliest stages of motor learning, we have to introduce a third major player in the brain, one that sits at the very back of your head, the cerebellum.
The little brain. And to understand the cerebellum's role, we are looking at the absolute newest research.
Yes, a massive paper by Chen and colleagues published in Translational Psychiatry in May of 2026.
It's titled Consistent Corticobasal Ganglia Cerebellar Activation in Early Motor Sequence Learning: A Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis.
The fact that this is a meta-analysis is highly significant, by the way. Individual fMRI studies can sometimes be quite noisy or suffer from small sample sizes.
Right, so a meta-analysis aggregates data from dozens of individual data sets, smoothing out the anomalies and giving us the most robust, statistically powerful picture possible.
And this specific analysis focused on fMRI data captured during the very earliest phases of the serial reaction time task.
And what they found definitively proves that the cerebellum is intensely active during day one, hour one of learning a new motor sequence.
Which is fascinating.
Traditionally, a lot of people just associate the cerebellum with basic balance. You know, if you drink too much alcohol, your cerebellum gets suppressed and you stumble. But it does so much more than just keep us upright, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It is arguably the most complex computational engine in the brain, containing more than half of the brain's total neurons.
Wow.
The Chen paper highlights that during early learning, the cerebellum is specifically crucial for initial motor coordination and the formation of internal models.
Internal models, what does that actually mean in practice?
Think of it as predictive coding. When you swing a tennis racket for the very first time, your brain creates a prediction of what sensory feedback it expects to receive.
Okay.
It expects to feel the impact of the ball, hear the sound, feel the vibration in the wrist. If you miss the ball, there is a mismatch between what the brain predicted and the actual sensory feedback.
That's a sensory prediction error.
Exactly. The cerebellum is constantly calculating the math of the physics in real time. It processes that sensory prediction error at lightning speed and uses it to update the internal model for the next swing. It adjusts the timing, the trajectory, the force.
So if the basal ganglia is the coach saying, yes, that was good, do it again, the cerebellum is the physics engine calculating exactly how far off you were and tweaking the angles.
That's a great way to put it. But the Chen meta-analysis also corrected some older theories about the cerebellum, right?
It did. For a long time, some researchers theorized that the cerebellum was also responsible for long-term skill automatization, that habits lived there permanently.
But the Chen paper shows definitively that while the cerebellum is essential for this initial error correction and model formation, its role diminishes over time.
It is deeply engaged at the start, but as the behavior becomes a true long-term habit, the cerebellum quiets down, and the corticobasal ganglia circuits take over the automatization process.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to try an analogy to map all these shifting responsibilities. Let's use learning to ride a bike.
Let's hear it.
When you first get on the bike, the cerebellum acts like the training wheels. It is constantly adjusting, calculating your balance, processing the sensory prediction error every time you wobble to keep you from falling.
Makes sense.
Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex and your basal ganglia's caudate are acting like a conscious instruction manual. You are actively thinking, put right foot here, push down, keep eyes forward.
A very high effort, cognitively taxing state.
Right. But as you practice, the networks shift. The expert cyclist has taken off the training wheels, so the cerebellum's heavy lifting is done. They have thrown away the instruction manual, so the prefrontal cortex is totally quiet.
And the behavior has shifted to the sensorimotor putamen, which train the cortex to build a direct superhighway.
Yes. Now the expert is just letting the physics of the bike and the deeply myelinated pathways of the brain do all the work automatically.
That perfectly visualizes the macroscopic network changes across the brain regions. We go from cerebellum and caudate to putamen to cortical shortcut.
But to truly appreciate the wonder of expertise, we have to zoom in even further. We need to understand how these networks actually build that superhighway at a microscopic level.
The physical hardware.
How does an instruction manual physically rewrite the biology of the brain?
For that, we are turning to a beautifully detailed 2024 paper by Roth titled Cortico-Basal Ganglia Plasticity in Motor Learning.
We hear the word plasticity thrown around constantly. Neuroplasticity is practically a buzzword in self-help right now.
It is, but Roth actually breaks down the physical plumbing of how it happens. Roth focuses on cell-type-specific adaptations through long-term synaptic plasticity and dendritic spine dynamics.
Dendritic spines. To picture this, you have to imagine a single neuron. It has a long cable called an axon to send signals and a branching tree-like structure called dendrites to receive signals.
And on those dendrites are tiny little protrusions called dendritic spines. They look like microscopic mushrooms or leaves reaching out toward other neurons.
They are the actual physical bridges where the chemical signals cross from one brain cell to another.
Exactly. And what Roth details is that when you are practicing a skill, these dendritic spines are not static at all. The physical connections between the cortex and the basal ganglia are literally changing shape in real time.
It's so dynamic.
Based on your practice, these spines can grow larger, they can shrink, new ones can sprout out of nowhere, and old ones can completely retract and disappear.
So when I sit down and drill a complex chord progression on the guitar for an hour, I am not just passively absorbing information.
No, you are literally forcing microscopic structures in your brain to sprout and grow.
I am physically building new biological bridges. The connections between my motor cortex and my sensor motor putamen are reinforcing themselves, literally widening the lanes on that highway.
And as those specific spines grow and stabilize, the connection becomes potentiated. This means the synapse becomes stronger. It requires less electrical stimulation to trigger a signal in the future.
The signal flows with less friction.
This functional circuit plasticity is the physical biological substrate of learning. The shift from the goal-directed caudate to the habit-driven putamen, and eventually to the cortical shortcuts, isn't just a software update. It is a massive structural hardware overhaul inside your skull.
It makes every hour of practice feel incredibly consequential. You are physically sculpting your own brain tissue.
Literally sculpting it.
But let's step out of the sterile environment of the practice room. Because life isn't a perfectly predictable bike ride on a flat, empty road, and a concert isn't just playing scales in your bedroom.
Very true.
What happens when the environment suddenly changes? What happens when the expert gets highly stressed or distracted, or there's a loud noise in the concert hall?
This brings us to the ultimate showdown in our understanding of expertise, the dual system framework of the brain.
This is where the behavioral rubber truly meets the road. We are looking at a comprehensive 2024 review by Bubang and colleagues from Trends in Cognitive Sciences titled Leveraging Cognitive Neuroscience for Making and Breaking Real-World Habits.
Bubang provides an incredible look at the dual system framework, which defines the two constantly competing systems battling for control over our behavior at any given moment.
Okay, let's set up the boxing ring. In the left corner, we have the goal-directed system. This system is driven by our prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral and ventromedial parts, working alongside our old friend, the caudate.
And Bubang explains that this system relies on action outcome, or AO expectancies.
Action outcome is highly rational. It says, if I perform action A, it will lead to outcome O. Do I currently value outcome O? Yes. Then I will perform action A.
It is flexible, it thinks about the future, it can adapt to new rules instantly, but as we've discussed, it is cognitively exhausting and extremely slow.
And in the right corner of the ring, we have the stimulus-driven system. This is driven by the posterior putamen and the premotor cortex. It relies on stimulus response, or SR associations.
The stimulus response system doesn't care about the outcome at all. It doesn't value the future. It is entirely rigid.
It simply says, when I encounter stimulus S, I automatically execute response R. You see the red light, your foot hits the brake. There is no deliberation.
It is incredibly fast and is highly energy efficient.
So, returning to the main prompt that started this entire deep dive, do expert performers use well-formed habits over prefrontal cortex-driven execution? Does the habit system actually win the fight?
The answer from the neuroscience is an absolute resounding yes. True expertise fundamentally relies on the stimulus-driven system physically outcompeting and overpowering the goal-directed system.
That makes total sense now. Because the expert has spent thousands of hours growing those dendritic spines, reinforcing those cortical shortcuts, the SR pathways have been heavily myelinated.
Myelin is a fatty sheath that insulates the nerve fibers, drastically increasing the speed of the electrical signal. The habitual pathway literally fires faster and stronger than the deliberative conscious pathway.
By the time the prefrontal cortex realizes what's happening, the putamen has already executed the movement.
But Bubang points out something fascinating about how this fight is refereed. There are specific parts of the prefrontal cortex that act as arbiters, dictating which system gets to run the show.
Yes, specifically looking at the prelimbic versus the infralimbic cortex, which is heavily studied in animal models.
The prelimbic cortex generally supports the goal-directed conscious behavior, but the infralimbic cortex acts almost like a neurological switch that can forcefully lock habits into place.
Wait, how does it lock them in?
Well, in animal studies, if a rodent is heavily overtrained on a task, it becomes a pure habit. If researchers artificially inactivate the infralimbic cortex in that overtrained animal, the animal suddenly reverts back to goal-directed behavior.
So it stops running the habit and starts thinking again, evaluating the rewards.
Exactly.
So the infralimbic cortex is actively suppressing the conscious goal-directed system. It's like the brain has a bouncer that physically kicks the conscious mind out of the club so the habit can take over the dance floor.
That's exactly what it's doing. It actively prevents you from interfering with your own hard-earned automaticity. It actively overrides real-time goal evaluation so the habit can proceed without the friction of conscious doubt.
But Bubang also highlights the vulnerability of this dual system balance, particularly how it shifts under pressure.
And this is the most crucial part for anyone who has ever choked in a big moment. What happens to this delicate balance under high stress?
Conditions like high working memory load, intense time pressure, or acute psychological stress actively decrease metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex.
The conscious goal-directed system is incredibly fragile. When you are stressed, the prefrontal cortex essentially drops offline. It cannot handle the computational load.
And when the PFC goes offline, the brain has a fail-safe. It immediately defaults to the strongest stimulus-response association available.
It takes the path of least biological resistance.
Now, consider an amateur in a high-stress situation. They haven't built those robust, expert SR pathways yet. Their habits are weak.
So when their prefrontal cortex drops offline due to panic, their default SR association might be a primal survival mechanism. Freeze, flee, or regress to a sloppy, untrained movement.
But for an expert, their default SR association is the flawless performance.
Think about the famous Michael Jordan flu game in the 1997 NBA Finals. He was visibly sick, dehydrated, feverish, completely physically and mentally depleted.
His prefrontal cortex, his goal-directed system, was likely barely functioning. He couldn't consciously overthink the game.
But it didn't matter. The stress and exhaustion knocked out his conscious mind, but left intact the deeply entrenched, heavily myelinated stimulus response pathways of his jump shot.
The stress stripped away the noise and left only the perfectly carved habit.
That is the defining neurological signature of elite performance. You have built a stimulus-driven pathway so strong, so structurally sound, that perfection becomes your default survival mechanism under pressure.
The stress actually protects the performance by preventing the conscious mind from interfering and choking.
It's incredible.
That is awe-inspiring. But naturally, I have to push back a little here. Building a perfect habit is great, but what if you have built a terrible habit?
Like what?
Let's talk about my golf swing. It is a complete disaster. I slice the ball every time. I have done it so many times that it is a deeply ingrained SR pathway.
Unfortunate, but very common.
If I want to fix it, if I want to break that bad habit, I essentially have to force my conscious, goal-directed prefrontal cortex to arm wrestle my highly efficient, heavily myelinated putamen. How on earth is that a fair fight?
It feels like the SR system will always win because it's biologically faster.
It is an incredibly unfair fight, and this is exactly why breaking bad habits is notoriously difficult. Bubang explicitly addresses this challenge.
Because the SR links are structurally enduring, meaning extinction training doesn't actually erase the old dendritic spines, it merely creates a competing inhibitory memory.
You have to use intense, strategic, goal-directed inhibition.
So if the fight is rigged against my conscious mind, how do I rig it back? How do I actually break the habit? You have two main strategies based on the neuroscience. First, you change the environment to avoid the stimulus that triggers the automatic response.
The SR system relies on a specific trigger.
Exactly. If you want to change your golf swing, you might need to change your stance, change your grip, or even practice with a completely different type of club for a while.
By altering the visual and tactile stimulus, You prevent the old response program from firing automatically, buying your conscious mind a few milliseconds to intervene.
I had to hide the trigger from my putamen.
Right. Second, you have to ensure your goal-directed system is fully resourced. As we established, the PFC is metabolically expensive and fragile.
You cannot successfully break a deeply ingrained habit when you are tired, when you are stressed, or when you are distracted.
If your working memory is occupied, your PFC simply won't have the metabolic resources to override the putamen.
You have to protect your executive function so it has the energy to do the heavy lifting of suppressing the bad habit while you build the new one.
And Boubang mentions a specific psychological trick for this, right? Implementation intentions.
Yes, implementation intentions are essentially if-then plans. By preloading a conscious decision, for example, telling yourself, if I step up to the golf ball, then I will pause for 3 full seconds before swinging. You use a single, highly focused burst of goal-directed control to create an instant artificial habit.
That pause interrupts the automatic sequence, giving you the window you need to consciously initiate the new corrected movement.
It's a very effective technique.
So stepping back and looking at this entire landscape, this realization completely reframes what it means to be a master of your craft. We tend to revere experts because we think they possess some superhuman capacity for focus.
Or that their minds are constantly calculating at light speed.
But the truth is almost the exact opposite. It's not about thinking better or thinking faster. It's about training your brain so rigorously, rewiring the physical synaptic connections so deeply that you no longer have to think at all.
It is a beautiful paradox. You use immense, exhausting conscious effort, spanning thousands of hours, to design a biological machine that eventually operates entirely without you.
Let's bring all of this together for you listening at home. The journey to expertise is not just about memorization. It is a physical, geographical migration across the territories of your brain.
It starts in the prefrontal cortex and the associative parts of the basal ganglia of the caudate.
On day one, you are consciously trying, evaluating every mistake, and relying heavily on the cerebellum to process sensory prediction errors and build internal models, acting like the training wheels on a bike.
But as you put in the hours, as you cross those 4,000 repetitions, your brain undergoes profound structural changes. Dendritic spines grow and strengthen.
The control of the behavior physically shifts away from the conscious mind and settles into the sensoromotor putamen. The basal ganglia acts as a coach, training the cortex.
Until eventually, the brain builds a direct cortical shortcut and elevated superhighway to run the habit on autopilot.
The basal ganglia task brackets the behavior, zipping it into a single file so your conscious mind is completely freed up. The amateur is struggling in the dark with a floodlight, but the expert is using a laser pointer.
Expertise fundamentally relies on the stimulus-driven system physically outcompeting the goal-directed system.
And when the pressure is on and the stress hits, the expert survives precisely because their baseline biological habit is perfection.
We have literally mapped the physical machinery of mastery.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to ponder on your own. We started this deep dive talking about finding the truth of human performance.
We've seen the dopamine, the GABA inhibition, the putamen, the cortical shortcuts. We know the mechanics.
But if our ultimate goal in practicing any skill is to physically rewire our brains to the point where conscious thought is no longer required, and the infralimbic cortex actively locks out our deliberate intentions, who is actually in the driver's seat when a master performs a masterpiece?
Is true expertise the ultimate expression of human control? Or is it, paradoxically, the complete and total surrender of our conscious free will to our own biological machinery?
That is a profound question to leave hanging in the air. Keep digging into your own sources, keep asking the hard questions, and remember, every single repetition you do today, whether it's a piano scale, a tennis serve, or just practicing a new language, is literally laying the physical, neurological tracks for your future self.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.